in the version that you're most comfortable with. We're going to leave folks on mute, but let us pray together. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Welcome again, one and all. I've discovered that I pray better when I am in the presence of others and when I can hear them. And I know that all of you are looking forward to that time when we will be regathered as one people of God. Today, it's a pleasure for me to share with the Ecumenical Institute community Doctors Brian Volck and Matthew Loftus. Dr. Volck is known to some in our community as a co-teacher with Dr. Joel Schumann of two of our modules in our Connect Faith, Health, and Medicine certificate. Brian Volck will be known to others as a fellow student this semester in New Testament. Brian has been a friend of mine for 20 years, and he spent many years practicing medicine on the Navajo Nation, a notoriously under-resourced area. Matthew Loftus is known to some in our community as a fellow student in Connect and in other Ecumenical Institute courses. Others who've gathered on this call have been supporting Dr. Loftus and his wife Maggie in their medical work in Kenya for many years. Both Matthew and Brian are prolific authors of blogs, journals, and Brian's several books, and they have recently authored pieces that bring together theological wisdom in relation to the corona crisis. So I've invited each of them to reflect with us today, and they have titled their talk, Fragility and Hope, Practicing Medicine in a Pandemic. After each of them speaks, we're going to invite some questions in the chat, and I'm even hoping to draw in Connect Professor Dr. Joel Schumann into that conversation as well. At that point, we'll invite you to, after we put questions and have a Q&A session, we'll close by 12:40, and with a prayer, at which point we invite folks to chat in some prayer requests. But for now, we've invited Dr. Loftus first, and then Dr. Volck. So we'll get you unmuted and invite you to share with us.
Thanks, Brent. It's an honor to be with you guys from across the world, and great to see some of my fellow classmates and professors again. And yeah, this is just really special. So thanks for joining in. As Brent said, I am working in Kenya right now with my wife. We work at a hospital called AIC Latane, Africa Inland Church, in a little town called Latane. If you've ever heard of Tenwick Hospital, we're about an hour north of them in Western Kenya on the western side of the Great Rift Valley. And because I'm sure many of you are curious, things here are not quite as rough as they are in America right now from the COVID-19 perspective. We do have a couple hundred cases that have been identified so far, and a few fatalities. But so far, either if the virus is widespread through the population here, it doesn't seem to be as bad, or it just hasn't gotten as widespread yet. And we're kind of in that place right now. You know, it's been about 6 weeks since we had our first case. We don't know if it's about to get really bad, or maybe, you know, God in his mercy, as we've been praying, will kind of spare sub-Saharan Africa for whatever reason, whether that's climate or genetics or, you know, viral subtypes or whatever. Honestly, there's been a lot more attention lately about the economic effects of the shutdown and lockdowns. There's also a curfew. Up until, you know, probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, there were actually, sadly, more people killed by the police enforcing the curfew than had actually been killed by the virus itself, which kind of gives you a sense of again, just sort of the insanity that we live through and some of the things that it exposes. So, and that's kind of the what I wanted to talk about today was just that I think a time of pandemic, some things are very are altered drastically in a really fundamental way. Obviously, some people are not working at all that could be working, and church is not meeting together. And there's much less physical contact between people in general, and many of the normal parts of human life are just simply not happening in a way that shouldn't happen. And in other ways, I think a pandemic is an apocalypse in the most traditional sense. I think a lot of us learn that when we think about Revelation and apocalypse, it tends to make us think of end times, but really the word means unveiling. And so I think a time like this unveils things that might otherwise be hidden. It puts stress on the fracture points in our society and lets us see things more clearly, good, bad, or ugly. Certainly we've seen a lot more people, acting heroically and really when they're called upon to sacrifice for the common good. I think a lot of people have done so. But other things are a little uglier. So, health disparities. We're seeing in America that, even though, for example, African Americans are not, are a certain percentage of the population, they're dying in higher numbers from COVID-19, which I think reflects the underlying health disparities that have always been there and will be there even when the crisis passes. I think we see the stress points in our health systems. At a time when everybody needs health care, many hospitals and health care practices are saying that they're running out of money, and they're facing possible bankruptcy. They're facing, having to lay off staff. Even us here at our hospital, just making the preparations necessary to receive COVID patients and modifying our hospital wards and buying enough personal protective equipment, those kinds of things, has really stressed the hospital financially. And then on top of that, we're not doing elective surgeries, which are the bread and butter that keep our budget happy. And this is happening in many places around the world, particularly in the US, where I think elective surgeries are kind of what keep hospitals afloat. Some of those elective surgeries I think are obviously when we say elective surgery, it don't just mean like liposuction, but like technically speaking, a cancer surgery is an elective surgery. But because you don't have to, it's not an emergency. You don't have to do it right in the next 12 hours or something. So technically it's elective. So a lot of those places are being canceled and other health things are being delayed. But hospitals that are trying and practices that are trying to adapt, they're just so fragile that they can't, that they're financially suffering in the midst of the crisis. So I think that's an unveiling of how structurally our system is not set up to care for people's health necessarily. It's set up to sort of keep things churning on a normal basis, and but the fact that it can't respond to a crisis without facing enormous financial problems is an unveiling of sorts. The question of what's essential, what's an essential job, what are the things, I think a lot of I have a friend who's a pastor who is kind of griping to me about, the fact that churches are not considered essential, and how could anything be less essential than church? On the one hand, and on the other hand, is it, what keeps the capitalist wheels turning? What's essential and what's not? What's good for people and what's not? And even church, I think, we've had struggles finding a church here. And I think that the struggles that we have with church and the flaws and imperfections and things that we see in church that we struggle with I think are ultimately meant to point us to the fact that church, that the gathered body here on earth, is ultimately a foretaste of what's to come in heaven, and our ultimate consummation in Christ of our worship together. So the fact that Zoom, I think most of us are now trying some variety of online church. It's not clear when churches will be allowed to meet again. I think it points to the fact that, yes, as good and real and necessary as the gathered body of believers is here on earth, I think ultimately, we are, the imperfections of Zoom church, I think, creates a longing in our hearts for our ultimate heavenly home. So those are some of the things that I thought about as being unveiling. But from a medical perspective, I think any new and severe illness forces us to confront the limits of medicine. I think it is very easy in the world that we live in the West anyway, to look at our giant medical metroplexes and all the things that they can do and the power that they have. I think we can be tempted into thinking that power is infinite. And certainly I think a lot of the world around us treats it that way, and doesn't like to think about the limits that our body faces. And I think we see a lot of active campaigning to really push past those limits. And I think this is part of why when it comes time to for any of us to die, there is always a struggle. Well, could we do a little more? There's a joke. All the doctors will have heard this before, so forgive me, but some of the rest of you may not have. There's an oncologist who loses one of his beloved patients, and he's just really shaken up. He had seen her through a couple of relapses, and she had a really supportive family, and he just loved her so much. And he decides, because the joke is that oncologists love to give chemo right up until the very last second. He decides that he's just going to go down to the morgue and give her one last chemo treatment. So he goes down and he stands in front of the door, and he opens the door and he goes to look, and her body is gone from the morgue. And he looks and he sees, and there's a little note scribbled next to the gurney, and it says, "Patient's gone to dialysis." So sorry, that's a little grim, but we're always pushing harder in medicine to try to do a little bit more, to push past what we are able to do, and in a way that maybe isn't honoring of the person who is with us, who is dying. Our bodies are very fragile. One of the crazy, many things we don't understand about COVID, but it seems to have all kinds of effects all over the body. People are presenting with COVID toe. I was just reading about this the other day. They're getting what's probably like small emboli, little blood clots in their limbs and their digits. Young people are getting strokes and pulmonary emboli, blood clots in the lungs. And I think that this may be why it's so fatal. But it just reminds us that even within our own bodies, there is so much that could go wrong at any time. And I think that when the modern medicine has deceived us by making us forget that we are fragile. I think it's, obviously I'm bragging a lot on modern medicine right now. I'm a doctor. I do like modern medicine. But the, using the power of modern medicine for good sometimes makes us forget about that fragility. And I think we have to recognize that. I think we have to honor that. I think we have to, a lot of the time, a good doctor will say, "I don't know." and we can't necessarily fix it. We can, try to do some things to help you to feel better. We can try this, we can try that. But if we're, I think if we're overconfident in what medicine can do, I think it ultimately corrupts our ability to love our bodies and love one another as a body corporately, because there will always be things that we can't fix. Stanley Hauerwas talks about how the mentally disabled, for example, are people who are a particular challenge for modern medicine. And I mean, he was writing a generation ago, but just the callous attitudes that a lot of people had, and the willingness to just sort of, let people die or abort them or what have you, in many ways reflected the fact that, despite the many advances we've had in medicine, people who are mentally disabled, we cannot fix them. So that causes an instinctual reaction to push away, that is obviously really devastating to people's humanity and dignity. And so when we don't honor the fragility of all people and the fact that we're all dependent on one another throughout our lives, we, in different ways, I think we miss that. And I think having a disease that we don't know about and can be very deadly, can be really devastating. So, and I feel like I'm probably near the end of my time. Is that correct, Brent?
I think we're there. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. We're going to get Dr. Hancock to unmute Brian.
I think, am I on now?
You are.
Okay. Well, thanks, Matthew. That was a wonderful dispatch from the front lines. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces and names, and some who I don't know quite so well. So I'm going to preface this by saying two things about the way I usually present. One is, for those who've been in my classes, they'll know that I usually start talking about medicine by talking about something completely different than medicine, and come into the subject sort of slantwise. The second is that I'm a writer, so I'm going to read what I wrote for today. I find that reading makes me sound less stupid than I otherwise am. So I hope this will do. One evening, not long before the statewide order to shelter in place took effect, I and my wife, Jill, were climbing into bed when she asked, "Is someone knocking at the front door?" I thought I heard a soft voice from the sidewalk below a few minutes earlier, but now I too could hear a faint tapping. Upon opening the door, we found a boy about 2 years old, dressed in pajamas and shivering in the cold night air. A slump-shouldered woman sat on the front steps. She looked up at us with heavy-lidded eyes and said in the muffled undertone of someone who's had far too much to drink, "We need help." There was no one else nearby, no car, no clue why she had chosen our house. I was wary, uncertain what to do. To be honest, I was a little scared that this was a setup, a ploy to get into our house for who knows what mischief. Jill, however, took one look at the child and said, "Come on in and get warm." We helped the mother to her feet, picked up the boy, and brought them both inside. She was clearly intoxicated. Her clothes were neither torn nor dirty, just disheveled. She was missing a shoe. There were no signs of physical trauma. The boy looked scared, staring silently at his mother, his eyes wide, his nose runny, whether from tears or a cold, it was hard to tell. And the diaper under his pajamas was twisted to the side as if he'd been dressed in a hurry. In time, he stopped shaking as we talked to his mother. She said she was trying to get to the baby daddy's house, but had lost her way. She lived with her mother in another neighborhood where she said she felt safe. For some reason, though, she didn't want to return there. She had no cell phone or ID and couldn't remember anyone's number. It was clear they needed what's traditionally been called a corporal work of mercy. What wasn't clear was how to help them. Jill and I are both physicians, but we hadn't trained for this. We brought them something to drink, some cookies for the boy to eat, then Jill quietly stepped away to call our pastor in search of advice. He encouraged her to call the police, which she did. By the time the officer arrived, the boy was in my lap talking to me while rubbing his snotty nose in my shirt. We were not a good example of social distancing. The police officer was annoyed at us for letting strangers in the house. Didn't we know how dangerous Baltimore gets at night? In the end, however, he managed to trace down the mother's mother, who quickly drove to our house to take her daughter and grandson home, thanking us profusely. The officer called Jill 15 minutes later to say that the boy's grandmother was grateful to have the two of them back rather than with the baby daddy, whom she described as an abusive alcoholic. Mercy, I said. Mercy indeed. I share this story because it can help us think theologically about healthcare during the COVID-19 pandemic without getting lost in the thicket of biomedical details. When Jill welcomed two strangers into our living room that evening, we were making it up as we went along. Few of us like to think our personal physician is doing that with us, but many cases don't fit the textbook descriptions. This was one such outlier. Yet we've been practicing for these moments since our medical school days, when we formed habits essential to our profession, habits like prudence, courage, truthfulness. No one in our rigorously secular medical school or residencies called them virtues. No one quoted Aquinas, Alistair MacIntyre, or Stanley Hauerwas. Some of our mentors admonished us to leave questions of God to the hospital chaplain and refer all moral dilemmas to the ethics committee. But in retrospect, I see that all that training now through theological eyes, further refracted by my more recent formation as a lay oblate in the Benedictine monastic tradition. I have time to name just two such habits. The first is hospitality, something that seems conspicuously absent in hospitals today. Yet hospitality and hospital derive from a single Latin word, hospice, which can mean both guest and host. What's more, these words share a root with the English word hostile. Linguists share these surprising connections and trace them all the way back to a Proto-Indo-European root, something like rosti, which can mean guest, host, stranger, and foreigner all at the same time. This jumble of contradictory meanings also appears in the ancient Greek word xenos, from which the 4th century Byzantine Xenodokia, the first true hospitals, took their name. Etymologically then, xenophobia may be less about fearing the stranger than fearing what we as the host might be asked to do for her. In most traditional cultures, hospitality is understood as a duty and a danger at the same time. Host and guest enter a relationship of mutual obligation. The host offers protection and inquires after the guest's needs, doing her best to meet them. The guest does not abuse the host's generosity and sincerely pledges to reciprocate. But a guest's inability to repay the favor should make no difference to the host. Chapter 53 of the Rule of St. Benedict says, all guests who present themselves are to be welcome as Christ. That sets a pretty high bar, especially now when it might literally make you sick. But the practice of hospitality requires the virtue of courage, which doesn't mean you're not afraid, but that you are afraid and you do it anyway. A hospitable hospital would welcome all patients, not at unnecessary risk to its healthcare workers, but through a series of calculated risks inherent to the profession, addressing present need before taking into account ability to pay, documentation status, cognitive ability, or productive potential. That's well worth remembering in a time of contagion and social distancing, whether we're staffing hospitals, debating public policy, thinking about shut-in neighbors, or opening the door to strangers. Hospitality is risky business, but from Abraham's day to ours, when has it been otherwise? The second habit is stewardship, a word whose long, strange history I wish we had time to discuss today. Faithful stewardship requires an awareness of place, need, and limits. Chapter 31 of St. Benedict's Rule lists the duties of the monastery cellarer, the monk who manages the material goods of the community. And here it is. Here's the important segment, quote, he must show every care and concern for the sick, children, guests, and the poor, knowing for certain that he will be held accountable for all of them on the day of judgment. He will regard all utensils and goods of the monastery as sacred vessels of the altar, aware that nothing is to be neglected. He should not be prone to greed, nor be wasteful and extravagant with the goods of the monastery, but should do everything with moderation and according to the abbot's orders. Above all, let him be humble. If goods are not available to meet a request, he will offer a kind word of reply, for it is written, A kind word is better than the best gift, close quote. What would it be like to conduct our debates about COVID-19 testing, medical resource allocation, and regional or local mitigation practices with this understanding of good stewardship? How would our lives be forced to change if we look seriously at our city or our neighborhood, aware that nothing is to be neglected? What might happen if we accepted the limits of our technological fixes for individual problems and used what's at hand for the community's good, especially our presence, our embodied witness in this time of grief and isolation? I seriously doubt thick accounts of practices like hospitality and stewardship will dominate the fractious COVID-19 response chatter anytime soon. The US medical industrial complex is too technology driven, too commodified, and too individualistic to consider them in any but the most superficial fashion. But people of faith must, I believe, ground themselves in such habits before engaging the disembodied abstractions of secular bioethics or the acrimonious partisan harangues that now pass for public debate. In a world of suffering, habits of mercy make strong medicine. The 18th century Hasidic master Rabbi Zusia of Hanapol once said, "All God does is mercy, only that the world cannot bear the naked fill of his mercy, and so he has sheathed it in garments." I'm pretty sure that we are some of those garments, not just healthcare workers, but all of us. And even in this strange time when we're overtaxed, anxious, and more than a little afraid of who might infect us or what nonsense our supposed leaders are fomenting, God still calls us to be garments of mercy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. What an image to live as garments of mercy. I'm going to invite Dr. Hancock to unmute Matthew and invite those of you who've gathered to type questions in the chat feature, which we'll curate and steward. The image of hospitality and the image of stewardship. I'm very mindful. We had two master's theses of students who would have actually been awarded diplomas tomorrow night, and one of those was on hospitality, and the other was on Christian economics, a form of stewardship. And for you to, Brian, to bring up both of those themes is very, for me, extremely resonant with work that others in the EI learning community have been focused on. Matthew, did you want to, did what Brian said provoke anything in you, or vice versa? Brian, anything Matthew said provoke an immediate response? Our gathered mass is a little less eager to type in at this point.
Matt's more on the front lines than I am right now. I appreciated him talking about what it's like to work under such strange conditions where the normal isn't available. I know all of us are adjusting to what's not normal, but medicine thrives on routine and knowing what situation you're in, and so that my colleagues who are on the Navajo Nation right now, where I used to work full-time and work when I can now, are dealing with an overwhelming burden of COVID-19, and the governor of New Mexico closed all the roads into Gallup, New Mexico, which is where we used to take our residents from Cincinnati Children's Hospital, to give them sort of a boot camp in cross-cultural medicine. I appreciate what Matt had to say about the difficulties of doing this, especially in a low resource setting.
I'm struck that you've reminded us, really, both of you have reminded us that Christian virtue is what prepares us um, to engage a crisis. It's not. It gives us both the eyes to see rightly, but also the habits we need to respond faithfully. Brian, you highlighted prudence, courage, truthfulness, hospitality. Um, let me just make sure, is the chat feature turned on? Yeah, okay, perfect. Um, it occurs to me that in the current situation, most of us hope that it will end. You know, you guys used the title for your talk, Fragility and Hope, and everybody's, you know, we're hoping for the time after this, right? But
Yes.
but part of what we're hoping for may be the false hope to get beyond this feeling of fragility. And I think both of you would agree that that's not a good thing. That in some ways, being a creature of the God that we serve is partly about learning to accept and even love the fragility that is our human creaturehood. What do you think?
Miroslav Volf says that fragility is an essential component of humanity. I think he says it's the essential fact of humanity.
Well, let's tag on to John Rogers' comment here, because Wolf also, with exclusion and embrace, is precisely using, you know, actual human touch and embrace as an image for our appropriate relation to one another. John Rogers mentioned the prohibition of human touch with COVID and how you try to address it with your team and the individual patient.
Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually just struck today. I saw a patient, and as I was doing my physical exam, you know, I see patients fairly quickly, so a lot of times I'm just sort of listening to heart and lungs and then moving on. But today this patient needed a cranial nerve exam, so I actually had to say, you know, take off your mask. You know, which it just kind of struck me with a strange emotional chord of like, wow, I actually get to see this patient's face, and unfortunately they don't get to see mine because I was going to take off my mask. But still, like, just you know, and yeah, like I'm glad now for when I get to do a physical exam, because otherwise I don't get to touch the patient. I don't, you know, we're not shaking hands like as normal, which I feel like is a really important way to just start off a conversation. So you know, I mean, when things, you know, if things get really bad here and in, you know, in place in the US where things are bad, you know, I personally feel like the church ought to deputize a couple of young, healthy people, either who have been infected already or who are willing to get infected, to go, you know, just hold people's hands as they're dying. Because I think a lot of people need that. I think not being able to touch family members seems to be one of the most tragic aspects of the whole process.
You know, there's an interesting contrast between you know, to hold someone's hand as they're dying, which is a reminder of sort of the ministry of hospice, which Brian mentioned, and then Matthew, to contrast that with your joke of, you know, the oncologist couldn't do one last chemo because they'd already taken the person out for another procedure. That the effort to treat when at times it's time to step back and to have genuine presence, right? I think part of what we're facing in this moment is reckoning with the technology compensates to a certain degree, but it can't replace touch.
No,
it can't replace.
Yeah, no.
I mean, two of the amazing things about being a medical professional or a healthcare professional of any sort, and particularly to be a physician, is that one, people come and tell you stories that they wouldn't tell to anyone else. about what's going on, sometimes not even to their pastor. I suspect that some people will tell things to the pastor that they won't tell to their physician, but as well. But there are things that people will confide only to somebody who's gonna who's there as a medical professional. The other is that we have the privilege of touching people's bodies, and we need to respect that in a very important way. But that's where we get a lot of our information about what's going on, and it's a way to convey our concern, our presence, and it's really hard to do telemedicine. It can be done, but
with presence, are you riffing on Audrey's question that Stanley, when he was here, talked about the one thing Christians can bring is presence?
Oh yes, embodiment. It should be obvious that embodiment is essential to the practice of medicine or practice of healthcare. But being present to the body is, I think, an essential that is often missed. People tend to the body as a source of information in which they can then manipulate, as opposed to being simply present to the patient, which is a much more difficult thing to do.
Matthew, but maybe the last question to you before we turn toward prayer. You've written with deep theological roots in some of your publications. Have you found any theological muscles getting extra workout during this time, as you've sought to faithfully, as a Christian medical missionary, engage?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, when you get emails from the U.S. Embassy about, okay, last flight out, you know, no more flights after this. There's I think a level of trust and surrender. You know, knowing like, okay, if it gets really bad here, like, and somebody else gets the ventilator before me, then that's it. You know, that those kinds of things that, you know, you work through. You know, yourself personally, for your family, but I think also in you know, it's been a great encouragement to me, just being with my Kenyan colleagues and you know, colleagues from really all over sub-Saharan Africa, who, you know, want to serve and are here, and you know, working and preparing themselves if things get bad, and also, you know, just sticking with what their you know, their commitments and their calling, to serve their own people. So just, yeah, that sense of being faithful, even in the midst of whatever crisis is coming, will come.
Yeah,
absolutely.
thank you. I'm going to invite you to type into the chat the initials of persons you would invite us to be in prayer for. And just to say, before Brian closes us in prayer, to riff on something that is in here from Deborah Donnelly Barton, thinking about how coming through Holy Week and into the season of Easter is a reminder in following the life and passion of Jesus Christ of human fragility, and that human fragility can be entrusted, as Matthew has said, to the one who holds the power of life and death. Brian?
Thank you, Brent. I want to close with a poem by a great poet and a good friend, Scott Cairns. And as usual, he moves from the somewhat humorous to the deadly serious in this poem. It seems to me, it speaks to me at this time when there's so much argument and blame finding and name calling, that maybe this will speak to you. I hope it does. It's a poem about prayer, but it's about the part of prayer that we sometimes don't pay attention to. It's called Possible Answers to Prayer. Your petitions, though they continue to bear just the one signature, have been duly recorded. Your anxieties, despite their relatively narrow scope and inadvertent entertainment value, nonetheless serve to bring your person vividly to mind. Your repentance, all but obscured behind a burgeoning yellow fog of frankly more conspicuous resentment, is sufficient. Your intermittent concern for the sick, the suffering, the needy poor is sometimes evident to me, if not to them. Your angers, your zeal, your lip-smackingly righteous indignation towards the many whose habits and sympathies offend you, these must burn away before you realize how near I am, how much I adore precisely these, the several who rouse your passions. Amen.
Friends, go in peace, knowing that even in this time, God is near. Thanks be to God.
Thank you.